It's been 90 minutes since the polls closed here in San Diego County. Clear results are emerging in some local and state races and in key midterm elections that will decide control of Congress and the fate of President Biden's agenda. Welcome to our first ever KPBS Election Night live stream event. As we report the results and break down what they mean with our experts, we also want to hear from you. What do you want to know on this 2022 midterm election night? You can join our discussion by submitting your questions during this live stream broadcast. And a reminder, you can also find all of the latest election results in both English and Spanish at kpbs.org/voterhub. Now, to get the whole picture view, we're joined by USD political science professor Casey Dominguez, Times of San Diego editor and publisher Chris Genowine, and our very own KPBS Metro reporter Andrew Bowen. A little bit later, we'll also be joined by KPBS North County reporter Tanya Thorne. We kick off our discussion with a look at the emerging power shift in Congress based on today's election results. So let's start with you, Casey. What's the state of the overall midterm races at this point?
Well, the state is that we don't yet know the answer to which party is going to control either the House or the Senate. The races that have been called, the Republicans have picked up a couple of seats in the House. The Democrats have defended a couple of seats that were vulnerable. And the races are all very close. And so the House, we're still going to have to wait quite a while to see what happens in the House. And the same is true in the Senate. Some races have been called in the Ohio race went to the Republican as expected. The New York race went to the Democrat as expected. The New Hampshire race went to the Democrat as expected, although some of those were people thought they might be close. But the key races that the control of the Senate hinges on, the Pennsylvania Senate race, the Georgia Senate race, the Arizona Senate race, the Nevada Senate race, those are all still way too close to call.
But I think there is one thing that is clear so far is this is a red ripple, not a red wave. There have been a lot of predictions that the Republicans would not just take the House and the Senate, but take them by wide margins. And I think it's still up in the air whether they'll achieve both of those.
Well, I was just going to ask you that question. How would you characterize Republican gains at this point? You've talked about it being a ripple right now. How much do you see that changing in the next couple of days, couple of weeks even?
As Casey said, the key races out there are still Pennsylvania, Nevada, Georgia. We'll have to see. The Republicans could pick up a couple seats. The Democrats could keep some and pick up one or two. That's still up in the air. The House, if the Republicans take the House, it's not going to be by a large majority. But Casey, you may have some further insights in that.
In a year when the president's party controls the White House and the Congress and it's a midterm election, you would generally expect the opposition party to pick up a bunch of seats. There were models based on past election results that had, just based on the economy in the United States right now, the Republicans picking up 45 seats in the House. And I think we can safely say that that is probably not what's going to happen tonight. there's cross-cutting politics right now. Our politics are pretty stuck. Democrats vote for Democrats, Republicans vote for Republicans. Some people are concerned about inflation in the economy. Other people are concerned about abortion. They seem to be turning up in numbers that are making these races very, very tight in those handful of close races. And so I think, maybe what we should expect out of our very close politics right now is kind of a stalemate.
And maybe something else that could be expected is that if Republicans don't win the seats that they expect to win, might they challenge the results? Chris?
Oh, yes. In fact, we're already hearing about that. There have been some suggestions in Arizona that people try to vote as late as possible to create crowds and to create uncertainty about what the final result really is. Yes, I think we're going to see that. How strong that is, I think, depends upon what the final results are. But one thing I think that's very interesting is in Georgia, Stacey Abrams has already conceded the race for governor. And I think that kind of model might be something that it shows the Democrats certainly are going into this willing to accept the results. And maybe that'll have an impact on how some of the more fervent Trump supporters look at results.
Casey, in the run-up to these elections, leaders, observers were really worried about election interference. President Biden said last week that we can no longer take democracy for granted. Did we see any glaring irregularities today?
No, I think we should be fairly, given the environment that we're in, I think we should be fairly happy with the results. There wasn't any widespread violence at the polls. I think there was one guy in Wisconsin who showed up with a knife and he was arrested. And, not that isn't super scary for the people who are there, but that's certainly not the kind of widespread violence we might see now as we look at, people denying election results or that kind of thing. That violence may still come. But in terms of other kinds of irregularities, there weren't more than the usual kinds of hiccups that come along with thousands of election officials, managing millions of voters, often on shoestring budgets. So, I think the election went off pretty smoothly.
Casey, go ahead. Go ahead.
Arizona may be the test case for this because you have two candidates, Blake Masters and Kitty Hobbs, Kitty Lake. Who both were election deniers early on, and they're losing pretty significantly, at least with half the vote in at this point. And that may be where we see some significant pushback.
Casey, we're going to know more about this in the coming days, but what can we tell right now about who voted in this election? I know that there was a lot of questions about whether Gen Zers were going to show up. So what do we know? What are we hearing?
I think what we know right now is anecdotal. There are definitely pictures of long lines of students voting at some of the major flagship universities. Saw some of those pictures of those lines at the University of Michigan, the University of Wisconsin, University of Texas. But just because there are long lines, that doesn't necessarily mean that young people showed up in large numbers, right? That can be a couple hundred people in line. And what we need to be talking about is, many, many thousands of people, most of whom are probably voting inconspicuously and by mail and that kind of thing. And so, that is an answer that we really, particularly me as a college professor who deals with students, that's a question that we'd really love to have the answer to. But those kind of demographic numbers, the exit polls, give they give sort of a picture, but they need to be weighted by the final results. So we'd love to have those answers, but we're just gonna have to wait a little bit, I think.
And Chris, polls show that Americans are deeply, deeply concerned about political divisions in this country and the prospect of violence. Does any of that surprise you?
Not at all. These races are close. People feel strongly about the party that they back. We've seen races like Georgia where there's intense feelings on each side. Same in Arizona. I think that I think that what's interesting, though, is that people are worried about very different things as they go to the polls. Yes, they're worried about violence, but when it comes to the actual issues, it's either the economy or it's abortion or it's the future of democracy. It's not a case of I like one candidate better than the other. It's a case of really strong feelings about the direction of the country.
So, Casey, we talked a little bit about Republicans challenging the results. What they've made abundantly clear is that they do intend to challenge mail-in ballots. What kind of effect is that going to have on delaying results being called or maybe even changing outcomes?
Well, we'll have to see what lawsuits actually do get filed or what gets considered by the courts in the coming days. Some of the Republican, Trump era opposition, because Republicans weren't always opposed to vote by mail, and some very Republican states like Utah do vote by mail. But the sort of undermining of vote by mail is a fairly recent phenomenon, and I think some of the ways that we're seeing the effects of that tonight and these election results are just in the delays in counting some of the mail votes that were cast more by Democrats than Republicans. But in some of the states where we're still waiting on results, like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, those are states where the state laws said you can't process your mail votes early. And so that we're seeing those effects in delayed counting. There are some legal challenges that are pending, particularly in Pennsylvania, about not counting any votes that where people didn't sign and where they signed but they didn't date the ballot properly. And those court challenges may, in a very close race, may still yet affect the results. But yeah, we'll have to see if there are any additional challenges.
Let's focus our attention to a huge race in our own backyard, a congressional race, the 49th district, where Democratic Congressman Mike Levin holds a double-digit lead at this point over Republican challenger Brian Maryott. Chris, do you expect this lead to hold?
That's an awfully good question, because Republicans have been saying, hey, wait till the last minute, wait till election day itself to vote. What we're seeing here is, at least from San Diego County, it's all mail ballots and the early voting up through, I think, just Monday. So I'm not exactly sure whether we're seeing the same thing in Orange County, because it's a district that straddles both. But I think we could see more of a Republican wave in that later on. But it's such a good start that I would be willing to bet that he's going to win re-election. And interestingly, this was one of the congressional districts Republicans thought they could take and flip, and it's not happening. We're seeing the same thing in another district in Orange County, where Michelle Steele is currently behind. She's the Republican incumbent. So we may have a case where there's no Republican pickup in Congress in California, and in fact, potentially one flip seat.
Casey, this was a race that the Democrats were worried about deeply. I mean, President Biden came here last week to stump for Levin. Does this wide lead, at least at this point, surprise you in any way?
The lead is a little wider than one might have expected. That I think in the last round, maybe he won it by 7 points. In the redistricting, it should be a little bit narrower than that based on the partisanship. But Biden was here, right? That's definitely a signal that the Democrats were very worried about that seat. I agree that it's a pretty big gap right now. Now, probably only half the votes are in, and the election day vote should lean Republican. But that's a pretty big gap to make up. So we won't know until we see all the results counted. But he's also Levin's winning in both counties, so he's ahead in both Orange County and the San Diego portion of the district, which is probably a good sign for him.
So, Chris, Democrats have a very thin lead in terms of voter registration in the 49th district. Do you expect any crossover between Republicans and Democrats in this district? Because I know that Republicans in this district aren't your typical Republicans.
No, they're very much centrist, even moderate Republicans. It's what you get living in a very wealthy coastal part of California. I also think that independents are likely to go for Levin, but much of what he's focused on concerns about the closing of the nuclear power plant there, making sure that's safe, other environmental issues. Those are things that resonate even with Republicans in coastal California. So I think he's got a chance at this point.
So I know that there was, as it has been the case across the country, there's a lot of voter anger about inflation, high gas prices. In this case, Congressman Levin blamed that on the 3 Ps, Putin, the pandemic, and price gouging. Do you think that message resonates with Republicans, Casey?
You always have to be a little bit skeptical that any particular candidate's slogan is going to reach enough people to make a difference. In a very, very close race, messaging can make a difference. If it turns out to be that close, then maybe we can sort of eventually conclude that was a good way to spin $6 gas prices, which might otherwise be a big problem for the incumbent party. But probably what we're going to be looking at is just independents that lean to the Democratic Party, and the district's kind of going to, mirror the Biden vote in that district. That would be my guess about what we'd see, is that people kind of just vote their party.
Okay.
And I think a lot of people looked at the whole gas price question and thought about it, perhaps logically, that, we had the war in Ukraine, that had a big impact. There's nothing either the Republicans or Democrats can fundamentally do about that in Congress. And in California, the prices came right back down after the governor announced the beginning of the winter blend gasoline, which is cheaper to produce. So that probably blunted the price issue.
We're going to pivot to some of the propositions and measures and races in California. Let's start with Prop 1. This would amend the California Constitution to give women the right, to enshrine the right of a woman to have an abortion and use contraceptives in the state constitution. As expected, Prop 1 is passing easily. Most Californians support abortion rights, so there's no big shock there. But there has been confusion over whether this proposition would expand abortion rights to include late-term pregnancy terminations. Chris, talk about that.
That was the charge from the no side on this proposition. We had an article from Cal Matters just a few days ago that explained that no, there's really this will not suddenly allow late-term abortions. It simply allows abortions to be taken care of in California. It enshrines it in the Constitution, which means that a future Republican-dominated legislature could not ban abortion. But it doesn't add any additional rights beyond just the basic right to abortion. The idea that it's between a woman, her family, the doctor, and nobody else.
Okay, before we go ahead, because I do want to ask you some questions as well, Casey, about Prop 1. I just want to remind our audience that they can submit their questions about these midterm elections, about state propositions and local measures. We'd be happy to pass those questions on to our two political analysts. Casey, what does Prop 1's expected passage today do to protect a woman's right access to abortion if there were to ever be a federal abortion ban?
Well, see, it definitely protects, as Chris said, it protects the right to abortion from interference by the state legislature by making it part of the state constitution. It becomes a much trickier question if you talk about Congress passing a law banning abortion, say after 12 weeks or 15 weeks or just entirely, right? If Congress were to pass a law banning abortion, that would be backed up by the supremacy clause of the federal constitution that says that laws passed by Congress beat laws passed by states if they're challenged in court. So I don't know that it's really that much protection against an act of Congress. Now, we're not looking at an immediate act of Congress that would do something like that. Even if the Republicans took the House and even if they took the Senate, Biden would veto such a thing. So that's not coming anytime in the short term. But I'm not sure that this really protects against federal action.
But it probably did increase the turnout for this election because
Sure.
It's a hot button issue across the country. Look at what happened in Kansas, for example, and what appears to be happening in Kentucky. There's a similar
and Michigan
ballot measure in Michigan. So it's a hot button issue that I think brought a lot of Californians out to vote who may not have otherwise in the midterm.
And Casey, California wasn't the only state that used this strategy to protect abortion rights. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, as Chris was just saying, there were other states. There was the state of Michigan also had a ballot initiative to put abortion rights in their state constitution that right now looks like it's going to be passing. And there was a measure, sort of a complicated measure. There is already a constitutional right to abortion in Kentucky, and there was a ballot measure to remove it from the Constitution, but that's losing. So abortion rights continue to probably be protected in Kentucky if those results hold up. But one of the things that's been true for a very long time is that the American people think there should be a right to abortion, at least under many circumstances, although not every circumstance. And that's been very popular for a very long time. The number of people who think that abortion should be banned outright has always been very small. And so as the Supreme Court doesn't guarantee a right to abortion anymore, and those decisions move to the states that have referendums and initiative processes, may all of them decide to put that decision to the people. And that may run up against state legislatures that might be controlled by Republicans who do want to roll back abortion rights. So states are going to be a real battleground. And the states that, because of even in very Republican states, there's still some support for abortion rights.
And what's interesting is that in all of these cases, the ballot measures have been quite complicated. For example, take Kentucky. You had to vote no in order to say yes for abortion. Same in Kansas. And the voters in large majorities dealt with this complexity, made the choice. So it says a lot about the American electorate, perhaps the female part of the American electorate, that they know what's happening and they know what to vote for.
So was the complexity deliberate?
Yes, absolutely. The hope, I think, in each case, these are Republican-controlled legislatures, and the idea is make it complicated. We want to effectively deal with this. And I think whenever politicians think that voters are stupid, they make a big mistake.
So, Casey, then where does this go? Voters are far more sophisticated than politicians think they are, especially on this issue. You said that, there's going to be a battleground in many states over this. This is going to continue to be a fight in this country for the next several years?
For sure. I mean, we've seen state legislatures pass pretty draconian prohibitions on all kinds of abortion, including in cases of rape and incest. And we've seen, children have to leave their state who have been raped and want to get an abortion in another state. This is already happening. And so we're going to see some states passing pretty extreme restrictions, and other states like California and Michigan and others making abortion a much more protected kind of medical procedure. But in the middle ground, there will be some really interesting fights about how far conservatives want to take these restrictions on abortion and how much the public has an opportunity to weigh in favor of more moderate policy.
Okay, let's pivot right now to two other propositions, 26 and 27. We have an audience question on this one from Karen Lawn. She wanted to know what the difference was between Props 26 and 27. 26 would legalize sports betting at tribal casinos in California's 4 private horse race tracks. 27 would legalize online sports betting across the state. Chris, both Props 26 and 27 look like they're headed for defeat. Why didn't they gain any traction with voters, at least so far?
Well, I think that there's concerns about adding more gambling into our lives. The sports betting could be. I mean, the main market for sports betting is probably young adults, young men who like to bet on fantasy sports and the outcome of games. It's not something that a large part of the population really wants to do. There's a lot of money at stake, probably billions of dollars, and that's why for 27 the national firms like BetMGM put a lot of money into it. The Indian tribes want to maintain their lucrative but very localized gambling operations, so they, I think, to some extent, reluctantly put up 26. And included horse race tracks because they're popular with another group of people. But I think the message here is Californians don't want more gambling. They're fine with gambling as it is right now.
So $600 million was spent both in favor of these two measures and against these two measures. Is that a staggering figure for you?
That is a staggering figure. I'm pretty sure that's the most it's ever been spent on initiatives anywhere. And it just seems, because voters, can be pretty easily persuaded to vote against ballot propositions, that just seems like these organizations just lit that $600 million on fire. I mean, it's just seems like a real waste. But the voters are generally going to be predisposed to say no to propositions, and particularly when there's negative ads. And this was two that were competing against each other and saying this one's bad and this one's good. And it was it's not really surprising that they went down to defeat. But maybe it would cause companies that want to get the California citizens to support initiatives that would favor their bottom line. Maybe they will think twice about doing that in the future.
So Chris, well, let's talk about that. You took the next question right out of my mouth, Casey. Chris, is this the end of the road for trying to get gambling legalized in California?
Oh, I think there'll be other attempts. They may be more narrow. I think if you look at the two propositions, 26 did relatively better. So I think whatever happens in the state has to go through the existing tribal casino infrastructure. So a more narrow one that said that sports betting could be allowed at certain casinos at certain times, limits on it, that might go. But not the online gambling, because I think that that's a step too much to take for California at this point.
Okay, and on to Proposition 30. This would increase the income tax on millionaires by 1.75% to pay for the purchase of electric cars, firefighting, fire prevention. It looks like it's a no at this point. We do have a question from an audience member. Lisa Sampson asks, why is Governor Newsom opposed to Prop 30? I see the Democratic Party supports it. Wondering what the key point is. Chris?
Well, I think the key thing here is this isn't so much aimed at electric cars and firefighting as it is to test the idea of significantly higher taxes on the rich. And if you look at California's finances, a significant part of public funds comes from initial public offerings of stock of new companies. Well, if you're going to heavily tax the people who start those companies and who get rich in the process, long term, you're going to significantly cut the revenue to the state. And I think that's why, it's very clearly why Gavin Newsom's against it. I mean, he was an entrepreneur before he became a politician. He developed a string of wine shops. I mean, if you tax the people who create the golden goose, if you will, you're going to have a problem raising funds. And I
And
think
how significant was Governor Newsom's opposition to Prop 30 in its supposed defeat at this point, expected defeat, I should say?
I don't think it was significant. I think that we Americans are optimistic. We think we're all going to become rich. So a tax measure that's going to tax rich people, that could hurt us, we might think, in the future. I think it'll be interesting how a similar measure in Massachusetts goes down. I haven't seen the results on that one yet. But the basic question here is, do you tax wealthy people at a much higher rate for a certain social good, or does that chase them out of the state? Does that harm you in some other way?
So another element of Prop 30, which was a little bit of a paradox, was the fact that it would set aside money, if it passed, it would set aside money to fight fires that have consumed timber, and yet the timber industry was against Prop 30. Why?
I think what they were doing, this is a technique with a lot of ballot measures, is it's the kitchen sink approach. You put in a lot of things that sound good to try to get its passage. We've done that locally on many ballot measures, like the one for the convention center that also included homeless funds and road repair funds. Again, I think this was really an attempt by the labor movement in California to test the idea of a significant increase in taxes on the wealthy.
Okay, now we're gonna move on to the least shocking part of today's election, and that is the fact that the California governor's race has been called for Democratic incumbent Gavin Newsom against Brian Dahle, who is the state Republican senator and a seed farmer. Chris, a year ago, Newsom beat back a recall effort. Today, he wins easily. But this governor still has to deal with some very, very intractable issues in California: homelessness, affordable housing, retaining middle-class jobs. How big of a challenge does he continue to face in this state?
He's got a significant challenge. Right now, California is doing great. There's a lot of tax money coming in, but I mentioned earlier the IPO problem. There have been very few IPOs this year, and California makes a lot of money when companies go public. So that's a problem he's got to deal with. Homelessness keeps getting worse. Building new housing, he talked about a big goal for, I think it was 3.5 million new housing units, and we're nowhere near that. So yeah, he's got a lot to do. I think that in this largely Democratic state, voters like him, and it's not, the Republicans have not put forward significant alternatives. So I think we end up voting for Gavin Newsom, and of course he's most likely going to be running for the Democratic nomination for president in 2 years.
And I was going to ask you about that. He has repeatedly insisted that he is not running for the White House. At the same time, he has thrown down with Republican governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, who won re-election as well tonight. So it sounds like you think that there's still a question mark above Newsom, or actually you think he is running for the White House.
I think it's very, very clear. He's done a number of national trips. There's about a month and a half ago, there was a Twitter feed image from him, and he's standing on the portico of the White House with the Washington Monument in the distance. I think he clearly has that as a goal. And he is an up and coming governor. He's much more youthful than many. He's much more youthful than, say, Trump or Biden.
And he's photogenic. I mean, he's charming. He looks like a Hollywood actor. Casey, how formidable a presidential candidate would Gavin Newsom make?
Well, I'll say first that although he obviously has presidential ambitions, I don't know that it's obvious that he would challenge Joe Biden if Biden decides to run again. It's very unusual for a really ambitious politician to challenge a reasonably popular president in their own party. It can really kill your career. So I don't know that he's challenging Biden directly, but if Biden for some reason didn't run, then yes, obviously he's preparing the groundwork for that. He has a lot of, resources. He is able to raise money. He has a great resume in terms of being governor of California, but I don't think we can forget the fact that our former United States senator is the vice president, and she would definitely, Kamala Harris would be the front runner, and there would be we'd be looking at a contest between these two folks, in addition to all of the there were 20 Democrats who ran for the nomination when Biden was able to win it in 2020. And I think we would expect a very crowded field. And he would have to prove himself just like all the other Democrats would have to try to do so.
This could be the introduction. He is a candidate, but his time doesn't come in 2024. It comes in 2028, for example. And he's young enough that could be the path.
I don't want to leave this conversation without asking you, Casey. Newsom has really blasted the Democratic Party leadership for not combating the Republican narrative that Democrats are a bunch of socialists and soft on crime. How much does Newsom's point resonate with Democratic constituents?
I think that the activist base of the Democratic Party, that's red meat for them, right? The Democrats, but that's not a new argument. Howard Dean in 2003, when he was running for the Democratic nomination, was like, Democrats should be, I'm from the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party. Democrats should distinguish themselves from Republicans. So this argument, there are other voices in the Democratic Party who are also sort of being more advocating being more aggressive and forthright in arguing against Republicans. And obviously Biden wasn't one of those. And that's not the choice that the party made when trying to unseat Trump in 2020. But yeah, I would say the activist base of the Democratic Party would be receptive to a message like that. But I don't think Newsom would be the only one making it.
Okay, now we're going to come down to San Diego County and take a look at the San Diego County Sheriff's race. In this race, Under Sheriff Kelly Martinez is facing off with Prosecutor John Hemmerling. Andrew, what is the state of this race right now?
Well, clearly it's looking very good for Kelly Martinez. She is not technically the incumbent in this race. Her predecessor, Bill Gore, retired earlier this year, and she chose not to throw her hat in the ring and try and be appointed as the interim sheriff, which would have given her a sort of de facto incumbency advantage. However, she is an undersheriff, and so that ballot title or the job title on the ballot definitely carries some weight here. With voters knowing that she currently works in the sheriff's office, and when you don't have a party affiliation on the ballot, like all these local races, often that can be a very easy decision for someone to make, that this is somebody who's already in the office and they want to keep them there. The partisan dynamics of this race, I think, are pretty interesting. Martinez is a Democrat, Hemmerling is a Republican. That wasn't always the case. Martinez used to be a Republican, and I believe Hemmerling used to be an independent. So it was only recently that they both sort of ended up on these two sides of the political spectrum. And it's not an easy race where you can draw a clear partisan line as far as their policy proposals. There's not a left or a right here exactly. So clearly, I think Martinez's endorsement from several unions in the sheriff's department and other, in the district attorneys association, her endorsement from the Democratic Party, which spends a lot of money on behalf of their endorsed candidates, carried her to a very comfortable victory in these early results.
Hemmerling had some issues also earlier in the race. He was he was endorsed by the San Diego Union Tribune, and then that endorsement was withdrawn. It was over some comments that could be interpreted as against the LGBTQ community that came out at a candidate forum in Ramona.
Andrew, you said that Kelly Martinez's job as undersheriff carried some weight in this race, but she also has some baggage. She appointed new leadership to the Detention Services Bureau at a time when it's, there's been so much reporting on the fact that the San Diego County jails have the highest per capita death rate, or in the state, or some of the highest per capita rates of jail deaths in California. It doesn't seem to have hurt her. Does that tell you that voters trust that she has the ability to turn this around?
Well, I think the challenge with that particular issue of jail deaths, and I'll just say this is an issue that really does matter. These are human lives at stake, and it's on the sheriff's department to create a safe place for all of the people who are detained there to await their trial. But the issue of jail deaths, I don't think is, it's another one of those issues where you couldn't really pin down how the two candidates were approaching this issue differently. Kelly Martinez said that, there was a state audit that made some recommendations and she was working towards implementing those recommendations. They're on a path, according to her, to improving this problem. Hemmerling would counter saying that, it's just not going fast enough, or, I want to do more than what she does. But I didn't hear from him a whole lot of real specifics on that policy. I think it's also worth acknowledging that the issue of how many people are dying in jails probably isn't top of mind when people are thinking about a sheriff's race. People do think about public safety. They think about crime. And so, when somebody's in a department like that, in a very high leadership position in a department like that, I would guess that a lot of voters would feel like, you want those folks to stay in office because they can, they know what they're doing, or they've got experience in that. And John Hemmerling, on the other hand, while he does have a background in law enforcement, or rather in policing, he was most recently a deputy city attorney in the city attorney's office, so on the prosecution side of things. And that type of ballot title or job title on the ballot, I don't think carries quite as much weight as something like undersheriff.
Okay, we are going to go back to the 49th Congressional District's race. This is the race between Democratic incumbent Mike Levin and Republican challenger Brian Maryott. I am joined right now at this point by KPBS North County reporter Tanya Thorne. She is reporting live from Democratic Congressman Mike Levin's election night party. Again, early returns show that Levin is currently in the lead over Maryott in the race for the 49th Congressional District. Tanya, what are you seeing right now? Describe the scene.
Well, I just got here to Mike Levin's election night party in Del Mar, and it's a packed room, a lot of excitement with this lead that he has right now. And I mean, just walking in, to be honest with you, it's like night and day, because I just came from Brian Marriott's election party, and night and day just because Brian Marriott's is very grassroots type of event, whereas to here I walk in and there's security and just a lot more going on. But this lead just really, is energizing the room. I'm gonna give you a little look just so you can take a look. So a lot of excitement. Mike Levin has not taken the stage yet. He hasn't addressed his supporters, so I think everyone's just waiting for him to just say a couple of words, right? As we're seeing these early numbers come on.
So Tanya, you've been to Marriott's. Right now you're at Levin's. Tell me, you probably. Oh, it looks like we've lost Tanya.
I'm back. Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know if you've gotten the chance to speak to anyone at Mike Levin's office. We've lost you again. I'm wondering if you're going to come back just like you did last time. And here you are. You keep on doing this disappearing act.
Sorry, guys.
No, that's okay. So I'm guessing you haven't had a chance to talk to very many people at Mike Levin's, but you have been to Brian Marriott's celebration or party or event. What are people at Marriott's campaign saying?
There was a lot of optimism at Brian Marriott's. I mean, he spoke to his supporters early on, and they, I think they really thought that they had this one. I mean, again, we're seeing early numbers, but they were really excited, especially as last week, as Marriott's team said, Levin brought out the big guns by bringing President Joe Biden to campaign for Mike Levin's campaign, and so I think there was a lot of enthusiasm and just excitement, and they really optimistic. So even as he spoke to his supporters, there was a lot of optimism there as to, I think we have this, I think we won. But his closing lines were, if we don't win though, in the off chance that we don't win, let's be respectful. And I really, respected that coming from Marriott's team, just addressing a supporter saying, in the case that we do lose, let's be respectful and know that someone here at the end of the day worked really hard on their campaign, and it's going to be sad. The volunteers, the families of these candidates, their supporters, everybody, right?
You've had a chance to talk to voters as well. What are they telling you about this race?
Yeah, this was a really interesting race because the 49th district straddles South Orange County and North San Diego County, and just two counties, two different demographics. And so I went out to the entire 49th district and spoke to voters, and a lot of talk about inflation and the economy, women's rights, democracy. But just, I think what really struck out to me was inflation and the economy were at the forefront of every voter's minds. And I think that's why Marriott was so attractive for voters, because he is a certified financial planner. So I think, for a minute there, a lot of voters gravitated towards him. He gained a lot of momentum, a lot of support, and that's where I think Levin's team got a little eerie about what the results are going to be like tonight.
Okay, Tanya, we're going to let you go and go talk to Mike Levin's people. And we're going to hear more from you tomorrow and the upcoming days about this race, the outcome, and where the district might be headed next. So thank you for that report. Okay, let's pivot to the Chula Vista mayor's race. This is between Democrat Ammar Campa-Najjar and Chula Vista Republican Councilman John McCann. Andrew, this was a race between a longtime Chula Vista politician, McCann, and Democrat Ammar Campa-Najjar, who has unsuccessfully run for Congress twice. Right now, as you can see, McCann is leading. What do you think is working in McCann's favor?
Well, I think he certainly has a better name ID for Chula Vista voters. While Ammar Campa-Najjar has been around, he's been in the news, ran for Congress a couple times. He, I don't think, has been all that present in Chula Vista politics until recently, when he decided to run for this race. And, there was some sort of campaigning from John McCann's point, or he campaigned on accusing Ammar Campa-Najjar of not even living in Chula Vista, which I think, to be honest, distracted from perhaps a more salient point, which is how involved has he been in Chula Vista, regardless of where he lives. So, it's an interesting race in that Chula Vista has a pretty overwhelming majority of registered Democrats. However, the Democratic candidate in this race, Campa-Najjar, clearly underperforming, perhaps in large part because this issue, or this question of his commitment to Chula Vista and being a part of that community, was actually something that voters cared about.
So, Chris, McCann hired an FBI agent or a former FBI agent to basically show who I guess followed Campa-Najjar and then concluded that he was spending the bulk of his time at his girlfriend's place, Congressman Sarah Jacobs' place in Bankers Hill. What impact do you think that may have had on this race?
Well, I think for a number of people probably looked at that and said, this is kind of creepy. I mean, are we at the point where our politics are decided by private investigators tailing us? So I think that worked against McCann. And, when I look at those results, those are very early results. It's 25% of the outstanding ballots, but not necessarily even, it's probably a little bit higher percentage of the overall vote, probably 35%. But it will be interesting to see what happens over time. If I remember from the primary, Campa-Najjar's vote numbers went up pretty steadily during the, as votes were counted later in the, as all the mail ballots came in. So I wouldn't count them out at this point.
Okay, Andrew, let's turn our attention to some district races for the San Diego City Council. In District 2, we have incumbent Democrat Jennifer Campbell versus Republican challenger Linda Lukacs. At this point, it does look like Lukacs is trailing Campbell. What are you watching in this race?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the only race on the city ballot where you have a candidate who is endorsed by the Democratic Party and a candidate who is endorsed by the Republican Party. There was one other Republican, a registered Republican, on the ballot in District 4, running against an extremely popular incumbent, Monica Montgomery Stepp, and her Republican opponent didn't really have much of a campaign presence. So I wouldn't really count her as a serious Republican candidate. But I think this is a race where the business community, the Lincoln Club of San Diego County, which is sort of the conservative arm of political spending that's not the actual Republican Party, they invested pretty heavily in Lukacs. There was a lot of hope that perhaps she could flip the seat back to a Republican seat. But if these results hold, and I'll say, this lead that Campbell has right now looks pretty comfortable, this will mean that there are no more elected Republicans in elected city office in San Diego. And I think that's a real, just a few years ago, we had a Republican mayor and 4 Republicans on the city council, but it does definitely speak to the toxicity of the Republican brand in urban San Diego. We're not talking about the suburbs here. We're not talking about East County, where there's still quite a bit of Republican support. But this is a district that is coastal. It is all of Claremont and basically all the peninsula communities, and whatever challenge that the Republicans thought they could mount with a candidate, and also trying to exploit some of the dissatisfaction with Jen Campbell as somebody who, a lot of folks brought up issues of not feeling like her office responded to emails or got back to them on a very basic quality of life issues that they were having. Despite all of that, it seems like Campbell is on the road to another victory in this seat, and Republicans are going to have to wait a bit longer before they can try to take back another seat in the city council.
Chris,
there was one interesting aspect of the race for Jen Campbell, and that was that she seemed to go against some of the neighborhood preservation interests. So she's for the removing the 30-foot height limit in Midway. She worked on a compromise for short-term rentals, and there's many in the neighborhood preservation movement would say no to both those things. Don't change anything. And to her credit, she's tried to work out some basic agreements on these things.
Yeah, and I think what these results perhaps show is that well, opponents of adding density to our neighborhoods, or opponents of growth in these more suburban style neighborhoods like Point Loma or Claremont. Opponents to those things might be very loud. They might make a lot of noise, but they're not necessarily in the majority. And so Campbell, can take this victory and show it to her constituents and say, thank you for supporting me, and thank you for validating all the positions that I've taken on those issues over the past couple of years.
Chris, I want to talk to you a little bit about District 6, where the only Republican on the council is being termed out. That's Chris Cate. And we have two Democrats, who are running against each other. It looks like Kent Lee is leading Tommy Hough in the double digits. How significant is it that there's not going to be a Republican on the San Diego City Council?
Well, I think it's indicative of the changes in the Republican Party, and they're now being reflected locally. In some ways, San Diego was a bastion of moderate Republican leadership, but as Andrew mentioned, the party's brand has become quite toxic. This particular race is interesting because it's similar to the Jen Campbell, Linda Lucas race. Tommy Hough, who's well known as a radio personality, environmentalist, has run under a Neighborhoods First platform. Again, it's sort of a low growth or no growth sort of approach. Whereas Kent Lee, very interesting. He's Asian. In fact, he ran the Pacific Arts Movement, which puts on the Asian Film Festival every year in San Diego. He's more of a growth, solving the housing problem kind of approach.
And Andrew, if Lee wins, what does that do to solidify this district as an Asian empowerment district?
Well, he's got a pretty comfortable majority now, and conventional wisdom in San Diego says that incumbents don't lose re-election unless there's some very bad scandal that's going on. So I would say it's a clear case that the desire to create an Asian empowerment district where you have a plurality or a large number of Asian voters, and also a large number of voters who are not white, who might group together with those voters and elect a person of color to the city council. That in this case, it's going to continue. Again, if these results stand, it's going to continue to be that Asian empowerment district. And I think that mattered to a lot of people in this district, that they do have a voice who is from their community, who has gone through the same issues that they have and share some of those interests. And that's not to say that Tommy Hough would have been a white council member first and wouldn't have served the interests of his Asian constituents. But I think that for a lot of people, because San Diego this particular area, Mira Mesa, Kearny Mesa, is the heart of the Asian community in San Diego. And if we can't elect an Asian American city council member to that district, it would feel, I think, for a lot of folks in that community to be, unfortunate or just sad that representation doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's pivot to some local measures. Measure A, this would allow the San Diego County Board of Supervisors to impose a tax on cannabis businesses in unincorporated areas. It looks like the yeses are having it. Chris, I know that opponents expressed a lot of skepticism that any revenue raised from this wouldn't necessarily go as promised to parks and fire safety and roads and health services, but it looks like voters didn't agree with them. Why?
I think voters looked at a cannabis tax and said, there are issues with cannabis, there's issues with the legalization of this new drug. Let's get some tax money for education. And I don't think voters were concerned about the impact on cannabis businesses, which, let's face it, some of them are a little bit shady. And I think voters look at that. The opponent said it's an equity issue, but you're dealing with a type of business where, equity isn't the first thing you think about.
And Andrew, what a difference 5 years makes. Back in 2017, the San Diego County Board of Supervisors wanted to ban medical marijuana dispensaries, non-medical marijuana dispensaries, and now they want to tax these businesses. What do you think of that? What do you make of that?
Well, I think that, frankly, the Board of Supervisors at that time was just out of step with the will of the voters of San Diego County. In 2016, we saw a pretty substantial majority of voters in San Diego County approve Prop 64, which was what legalized adult use cannabis. And with the Democrats taking a majority on the Board of Supervisors, opening up this business to more opportunities for folks to participate in the legal market, I think was a very easy position for them to take. And these results for Measure A basically just say that folks are, regardless of how they feel about cannabis being legal or illegal, they do want it to be taxed, and it is it is legal. That is the fact. And so as long as it is legal, I think a lot of folks are okay with that industry shouldering a greater tax burden to support public services.
Okay, and onward to Measure B, the trash collection fee. This looks like an extremely tight vote. So Measure B repeals the 100-year-old ordinance that guaranteed free trash collection for single-family homeowners. Andrew, did you expect the vote to be this tight at this point?
I'm not surprised that it's tight. It's a tricky issue, I think, for people to understand. So, and it never seemed to me like it was going to be a slam dunk for either side. For a really long time, this issue of offering trash collection services to single-family homes without charging any separate fees has been seen as a third rail in San Diego politics. And you just don't ask single family high propensity voters, folks who live in detached houses, you just don't ask them to impose new fees on themselves. And so what we're seeing, I think, with this is a real test of whether that was actually true. City Council President Sean Elo Rivera was the one who decided to put this on the ballot and try and get a coalition of his council members to at least put the question to voters. This is not I'm based on these margins. I'm certainly not comfortable with making any predictions here.
I won't ask you.
Yeah, but it is, I think, just a question of San Diego, I think, historically has always been very skeptical of new fees or new taxes. And even in a case like this, where the measure itself doesn't impose any fees, that would have to come from a cost of service study that the city would have to produce. But it is something that it could certainly help the city, the city's chronic budget issues. One of the challenges with trash collection, offering trash collection without recouping any of those costs in the form of fees, is that it's actually getting a lot more expensive to collect waste in California. There's a new state law that requires cities to collect organic waste and recycle that, so kitchen scraps. And the city, if this measure doesn't pass, and if the city isn't able to start charging fees for trash collection, it's going to be spending more and more of its general fund dollars on this particular service. When folks in multifamily housing and in apartments and condos and businesses have to pay, they have to pay separately for this. They're paying their property taxes, and they're paying a private waste collection company to pick their trash up. So it's a tricky one, and I'm very eager to see these results get a little bit clearer.
So turning our attention to Measure C, this would allow buildings taller than 30 feet to be built in San Diego. This is another really, really squeaker of a rate, not race, but vote. This is a replica of what was on the ballot 2 years ago and what voters approved 2 years ago. However, it looks like this vote is a lot closer than last time. Why do you think that is, Andrew?
Well, a couple things have happened since 2020 when this measure passed. One is that there was a successful lawsuit that claimed that the city had not conducted a proper environmental analysis of raising the height limit in the Midway district. It did that analysis, and there's another lawsuit challenging that environmental analysis, which we don't have to get into too deeply right now, but. The question is ultimately, do we want to raise the height limit in the Midway district? This is an area that's very plagued by blight. There's not a lot of incentive for property owners to invest in their land that they owned there, because as long as you're limited to 30 feet, it's very hard to put all that money into building something new if you're so limited in what you can actually build. So I think it's a lot closer because, the no side, I think, got a lot more organized. They had this argument that they could point to that the city had not conducted or failed to conduct a proper environmental analysis. Turnout, I think, is an issue here. We've already seen lower turnout in the 2022 midterms versus a 2020 presidential year. And so all of those factors, I think, are contributing to this being a bit of a nail biter.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrew, for your comments. You provided a lot of insight in some of these measures and races. I want to return to the midterm elections. It looks like the race has been called for John Fetterman in the Senate race in Pennsylvania. Casey, I want to get your reaction to that.
Well, I think some places have called it, and oh wait, there it is, coming from the New York Times on my phone right now. That is a pickup for Democrats, and so that gives the Democrats the ability to lose either Nevada or Georgia or Arizona, and still hold on to their very, very tight 50-50 majority with Kamala Harris in the Senate. So I think Democrats have to consider that pretty good news. We still don't know the results of the Senate. We still need to find out what happens in Nevada and in Arizona and in Georgia. But that I would say Democrats are probably very glad to have picked up that seat that had been held by a Republican who retired.
Yeah, it's interesting that it looks like Kelly is well ahead in Arizona, which would keep that in the Democratic tally. And in Nevada, John Ralston, who's sort of the dean of political reporters, has made a prediction, and he's usually right, that the Democratic incumbent there is going to get reelected. So it seems to me there's a good chance that the Democrats actually pick up one seat.
So I want to take a bit of a big picture view here. This midterm election has been described as the most consequential of our lifetime. Chris, is that an overstatement? What do you think?
I think it is, in the sense that it comes right after, 2 years after the insurrection at the Capitol. There's the question about can we have a successful national election in the wake of that? What kind of charges will election deniers bring against it? And was 2020 simply a vote against Trump, or was it a more significant sort of change in the direction of the country? And I think this is going to go down, even if the Republicans do take the House. This is probably going to go down as the smallest ripple of a midterm election in decades.
And Casey, what are your thoughts on this? How impactful was this midterm election? How much was riding on it? How high were the stakes?
Well, with the country as deeply divided as it is, and with a new presidential election always on the horizon, and the prospect of the Republicans nominating Donald Trump again, some of the key questions about this election are how many people who deny the results of the 2020 election will end up in the House of Representatives that might have the possibility of judging the 2024 election. How many of the people who deny the 2020 election are going to be running elections in 2024? So I think those are some of the things that make this a more important election than usual. Otherwise, all our elections are important, and control of the House is always important for policy, and control of the Senate's always important for policy. But it's the consequences of 2020 and the way that our elections will be run in the future that I think are especially important this year.
And there's obviously some synchronicity between the elected officials who are election deniers or outright or are doubters and constituents. There was a USA Today poll that came out last month showing that 2/3 of Republicans were not prepared to trust the midterm election results. Chris, how does that perspective get changed?
I think it gets changed with time. I think that it'll be very interesting to see what happens in Arizona, possibly in Pennsylvania, in Georgia. But I think that Americans over time will begin to see that what happened on January 6th, the Stop the Steal effort, was in fact a lie. And the results of this election, I think, will help that.
If I could just add to that, one of the things that would help that would be that if the election deniers lost, that would help that. But I think more than just time, I think that the Republican Party has to adopt a more responsible attitude about elections, right? If people will believe what the people they trust are telling them, and so if there continue to be leading Republican politicians that tell voters not to trust elections, lots of Republican voters are not going to trust elections. So
maybe not vote in them.
That may help.
Okay, I want to close the show in a few minutes, but before I do that, I want to make sure I get some closing thoughts. And let's start with you, Andrew Bowen. What really stands out from the results tonight with you?
Well, I think we're continuing to see the bluing of San Diego County with some exceptions. We mentioned the mayor's race in Chula Vista with a Republican leading there. Also a Republican, Ron Morrison, having currently the most votes in National City. And there were 2 Democrats running in that 3-way race where nobody needs an actual majority. It's just a plurality of votes. So, splitting the Democratic vote there, and that sort of complicates the narrative. But we're definitely seeing a good night for Democrats in county government on the issue of housing, which is the thing that any local politician will tell you is the top of mind for many voters. It seems like San Diego is continuing to, for the most part, endorse this idea that we need to build more housing with the election of Kent Lee and Jen Campbell to the city council, and the very, very slim majority of yes on Measure C, which were all, arguably housing related races on the ballot. It appears that is, the continued desire of voters is that we we allow our city to grow, do it responsibly, but we're not going to lock our neighborhoods in amber, and we're actually going to let that growth happen.
And Chris, what's going through your mind as we near the close of this midterm election day in 2022?
Well, the race in the 49th district really stands out to me. It was one that Republicans thought they could pick up, thought they could flip, but in fact, it looks like Mike Levin will have a significant victory. And I took a screenshot this morning of the Real Clear Politics top stories for the day, and the leading one was, why voters will oust Democrats from power across the U.S. And what I think is significant is conservative media, conservatives, thought that there was going to be a red wave, and it's a ripple, if at all, and probably the least significant midterm change in a number of decades. And I think it shows that what Americans really think is not necessarily what we're picking up from some of our media sources and from some of our polls.
And Casey, you get the last word. What's your biggest takeaway from today?
Well, I'll echo what Chris said about, this being a very, if it's not a big loss, then it's a big win. If it's not a big loss for Democrats on a night like this, with gas prices at $6 a gallon and the president unpopular, and it's a midterm election, if the Democrats aren't losing badly, they're having a good night. And I think certainly if it looks like they're able to keep the Senate, that's a very good night for them. And if the House, there's still a chance they can hold on to the House, which would be kind of extraordinary. But at the very least, if they don't lose a ton of seats in the House, that's a good night. And I think, one of the questions is, maybe, usually the question is, well, how did Democrats pull that off? But I think one of the questions is, how did Republicans not do better? What is it that they're not offering the American people that would cause them not to be able to capitalize on the kind of, murky economy and dissatisfaction in the electorate that we do see in the polls. And so, usually the response of a political party that doesn't do as well as it should in elections is to have some tough conversations about how to do better in the future. And it'll be really interesting to see if the Republicans have any of those conversations, or if they sort of double down on the, this is not our fault kind of narrative.
And we're going to close it there. I really want to thank all of you today. Casey Dominguez, political science professor from USD, Times of San Diego editor and publisher, Chris Genowine, Andrew Bowen, KPBS Metro reporter. It's been a really insightful discussion, and there's obviously more to come in the coming days and weeks. I also want to thank our audience members who submitted their questions, and our thanks to San Ysidro Health, San Diego Public Library, San Diego County Library, and the Partnership for the Advancement of New Americans for helping to distribute information on the KPBS Voter Hub and the resources available to our community. And a reminder, for a full list of today's results, you can go to our website, kpbs.org/voterhub. I'm Amita Sharma, and good night.